Sanjeev. Oh, okay. Thanks. Can folks in the back hear me? I thought this, okay. So what I'm going to do today is talk actually about a very general topic. I'll give some experimental details. But the general topic is one of temporal dynamics in information retrieval and information systems more generally. So when you think about a lot of the information resources you interact with, they're highly dynamic. The web's a great example, blogs, Web 2.0 kinds of things, but even your desktop, even web pages, as you'll hear later, are constantly changing. Yet, what's sort of startling, given where I am at Microsoft, is that almost none of the tools that we provide really take advantage of those dynamics. So, an information retrieval engine indexes a single time slice. Whatever the page was when it was crawled is what's indexed and retrieved. Even the browser only shows you what's there when you visit the page. And so the question that we've been looking at over the last few years in collaboration with several colleagues and interns is the extent to which we might better be able to characterize and understand the temporal dynamics of information, and secondly, to support people both with tools like browsers and with improved retrieval algorithms. So let me just start by talking about how prevalent change is in information retrieval systems. First of all, there are new documents and queries all the time. The query volume changes over time. You know, queries that come in are not IID. There are, this is an example of the query Lollapalooza, and there are two peaks, one when the tickets go on sale, another when the event happens. I actually gave a talk recently at SICM, and so I typed in the query SICM, which is an ACM conference on information management and retrieval, and that has three peaks every year, going back over the last 5 years. One when the papers are due, one when the acceptance notifications and registration comes out, and then the smallest of all the peaks is when the conference happens. So lots of things that we deal with have these kinds of temporal periodicities. And as a search engine, that's exactly the sort of thing we want to be able to take advantage of. Whether you can predict it or whether it's a new event that you can't predict it, the fact that you know that there's a spike in the queries should be something that you can leverage. I was talking to Alex earlier today, and he was talking about how they had used temporal profiles of words to do alignment across languages. So there are lots of ways in which you can use the dynamics of content over time. The documents also change over time. This is a term longevity plot, which I'll describe later. But the content on a page, like my homepage or the New York Times homepage, is constantly changing. What's also interesting is that the metadata associated with that page, the information you extract from it, is changing. So if you go to the U.S. Senate in three months, the senators will be different than they are today. And I don't know anybody in the information extraction community that's really worried about what facts you extract today and how those propagate over time. User interaction changes over time. So what anchor text is associated with a page, if you're a search engine, what pages people click on in response to a query, page visits, and so on change over time. What's relevant to a query changes over time. So the query, I did Hurricane Earl in 2010 because I was visiting New Jersey and it was about to stream up the coast. And what should I find as number one but a Wikipedia page from 1998, or about the Hurricane Earl in 1998. Now indeed it was a big hurricane, it caused all sorts of damage. It may well be what people want even today when they query for it, but it's certainly not what most people wanted in September of 2001 as it was barreling down on the East Coast. A query like US Open 2010, where you even specify the date, means a very different thing in May when there's a golf tournament than in September when there's a tennis tournament. So what's relevant to a query changes over time and should be reflected in search engines. And so change is really pervasive in information systems, yet we as a community are not doing very much either to capture that data, to represent it, and then to reason about it. So what I'm going to do here is quickly go over two general areas. One is I'm going to start by summarizing and characterizing change in digital content. I'm going to talk about how content on a page changes, how people revisit and refine information, how that evolves over time, and then the relationship between change and revisitation. And then I'm going to describe two tools that we've built that try to help people in understanding change and to improve our retrieval systems by leveraging change. Now I'm going to take examples from web search, and the tools are going to be tools that we've built, but I hope you'll see that this notion that change provides a really valuable signal that we should, I think, leverage more broadly is a much more general notion. So here's just a little schematic of what I mean. These are thumbnails of the Microsoft Research homepage over a period of 13 years. And this is just meant to illustrate that, first of all, that the thumbnail changes a fair amount. You can see the images are different. There are some years when there are lots more changes than other years. So the world of even a page like Microsoft Research homepage is changing. User revisits, whether they come from browsing to it or searching, also vary over time. So there may be times when lots of people are coming to the Microsoft homepage. There may be times when almost no one is. Okay, but again, today's search experiences consider whatever version of the page was there when you crawled. The browse experience shows you exactly what's there now, what the page looks like today. And what this fails to do is show you anything about what the page looked like last time you visited, what the dynamics, the trajectory of that changes in general. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I guess it's important to note that compared to libraries where it was content did not change as much, you might get new volumes of books from time to time. You certainly had some information about the interaction patterns because some books had more well-worn patterns, some were open to certain pages, but you didn't have as much dynamics as we do in digital environments. So the digital dynamics are really easy to capture. Here's the Microsoft Research homepage as it was a few days ago. This is what it was like in 1996. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's sort of this smushed computer and somebody's head imploding. And this is serious professional site 16 years ago or something like that, 14 years ago, I guess. Here's the CS page for your department. This is what it was like. Do people remember this? Remember the puzzle years? This is what it was like about 12 years ago, I guess, and this is what it was like the year before. So it's actually changed a lot visually, and I'll show you how the content has changed. Here's a thing that doesn't look like it's changed as much. Here's Bill Gates's homepage on Wikipedia, so this is a couple years ago. This was last year, so it's really not all that different. But if you look at the changes, there are actually some very fundamental changes in that page. So his name changed from William Henry Gates to Bill Gates. Right? They changed the name, and you'd never know it by looking at this, versus this. Right? How much stock he owns, some criticism of Microsoft, the usual things are also changing. His age changed. I think he just had another birthday recently, so it should be updated again. But looking at this, you would have no idea what was new and interesting relative to your intent in visiting that. So again, I'm going to start by characterizing how content changes over time. This will be kind of a fast-forward summarizing about a half dozen or so papers that we've published. And at the top of each section, I have the papers that are relevant. So we wanted to understand how web content changed over time. And to do this, we developed two collections. One was a series of 55,000 pages that we selected based on how often and the patterns with which people revisited them. So these are pages that people visited and revisited. We crawl these 55,000 pages once an hour for almost 2 years now. Okay, we also had a larger collection of 6 million pages. These turn out to be pages that we crawled because they were returned from the Live or MSN or Bing search engine for about 100,000 queries that were in an evaluation set. Okay, so what we want to do, we crawl these, I guess, every 2 days for 6 months. So, yeah.
You figure out, these were done with cookies about figuring out which users are revisiting the page?
Right, so,
give you that information?
Right, so this data set is collected from a toolbar that people opt into a customer improvement program. Okay, so there's a user ID, yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
All anonymized, but at least you have a unique ID for user. So there are a bunch of metrics that we can use. I'll talk very briefly about some summary measures like the number of changes, the amount of change, the time between change. I'll talk about a notion that we have called a change curve that summarizes the amount of change over an extended period of time, and then I'll talk about some within-page changes. So this is just a bunch of factoids about web change. 33% of the web pages change over a 5-week window. 66% of the visited web pages change over that same period of time. So pages that people are visiting change more often. And of those visited web pages, 63% of them, so about 40% overall, change every hour. Okay. So there's a lot of dynamic content being generated on web pages. The average, so the next are just some more breakdowns about that. So the average dice coefficient, which is the word overlap between successive versions, is about 80%. The time between changes is about 5 days, the average time between changes. And then you can break it down by different time slices. So .edu and .gov pages change less frequently and by not very much. .org pages change a lot, but not very much. .com pages change at some intermediate rate, and they change a lot. Yep?
So does this include the boilerplate, or just you extract
We did not do anything to extract boilerplate sort of navigational information, and you'll see later when I talk about sort of the steady state content. So some of the non-dynamic portions of a page are kind of boilerplate header, footer information, and some of it is actual content that kind of recurs over time. But we didn't do anything by analyzing the details of the DOM structure or visual layout to try to figure that out. So those are the summary metrics. We also developed what we call a change curve. So imagine that you start with a page, and then what I'm going to do is compute the difference between that version of the page and pages at different intervals. So I'll compute the difference at time 1, difference at time 2, difference in time 3, and then just plot that. And what you get when you do that, so on the x-axis I have the time since the initial starting point, and on the y-axis I have the amount of overlap. And you see curves that look very much like this. So what this says is, I should have this little pointer, I guess. What this says is, we'll say at time t plus 1, there's a fair amount of drop in the overlap. At time t plus 2, there's more difference and so on. But it asymptotes at some point in time. And that doesn't mean that the content doesn't change after that point in time. It means that on average, relative to the first point, 2 subsequent versions have the same amount of overlap. So imagine on the New York Times homepage, a lot of the boilerplate stuff will be the same, but it doesn't mean that all the words are the same, or that some of the words will rotate in and out of the page. But most pages kind of asymptote, whoops. So most curves kind of look like this, and what we do is we try to identify that inflection point, right, which we call the knot point here. The x-axis again tells you how fast stuff disappears off a page, and the y-axis tells you basically how much of the vocabulary on the page is changing averaged over time.
If I wanted to say it in a sentence, should I say that things that change will keep changing, and things that didn't change tend not to change?
No, that's not necessarily true. We actually have plots of the DOM elements on a page and can look at how dynamic they are. Most of the DOM elements don't change. I mean, DOM elements themselves don't come and go very much. Here's just 2 examples of pages. So I think the first one up here is Craigslist for Los Angeles, and you see that that falls off very quickly and asymptotes out to about 50% overlap with an initial page. This is a page called recipes.com. That changes much more slowly and asymptotes at a much higher overall similarity. Okay? And this overall similarity is, I'll show you later, is again due to two things. One is the boilerplate information, and then other are words that tend to occur a lot on that page. Okay, and in fact, here it is. So these figures here just talk about, in the aggregate, what the change is like on a page. What I'm going to do now is talk more about how individual words on a page change, because I'm an information retrieval person. So if we want to understand what words are interesting on a page like recipes.com, we've used a couple of different measures. One is just divergence from the norm. So it's a KL it's the terms that have a high divergence from the norm are terms who contribute a lot to the KL divergence of this page from the collection as a whole. Okay, so for recipes.com, those words are things like cookbooks and salad and ingredient and barbecue and so on. Okay, and so those words, when I took that snapshot, were the words that were most characteristically divergent of this page. But words also come and go on a page, and those are going to be important, I think, for retrieval purposes. So this is a goofy plot. We call it a term longevity plot. And what's on the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is words. And what this means is that the word cooks appeared in September, and it appeared every time we crawl this, sort of every hour from September to December, the word cooks was on allrecipes.com. Other words like, weeknight tend to appear, disappear, they reappear, they disappear. This is in the fall, so you can see, frightfully, stews, you can later see latkes, you can see merrymaking and yams. So there are words that come, hang out for a while. There are others that come and then stay for longer periods of time. So in addition to these notions of divergence, what makes a word on this page different from the aggregate, we think that important words on this page are going to be words that are there from day one and tend to stay for long periods of time. So on allrecipes.com, those words are ingredient in cookbooks. Those are words that distinguish this from other stuff in the collection, but also tend to be there time after time. Okay, and these are just different term longevity plots. This was the All Recipes one. This is Craigslist, and that one is Best Buys, I think. They very different cadence of terms appearing in, in coming. And so if I want to query Best Buys, this is a very different set of words than it is over here. And we should take advantage of that from a retrieval perspective. And I'll tell you how we do that later. I'm going to really run through user revisitation. So users visit web pages at varying intervals. And to study this, we're going to use, you asked about how we got the data for the earlier study. We're going to use these toolbar logs that are, again, are opt-in data from a popular Microsoft toolbar to understand how often people come back to pages, and we're going to use query logs to understand how often people repeat queries. And we also did a survey to understand intents and revisiting. So what was the last page you visited, Sanjeev? Others of you start thinking.
I think I visited the French Memorial page.
Okay. Okay. And is that something you'd been to before?
Several times in the last week.
Okay. Mark?
Email.
Okay. So that's a page presumably you go to more than once or twice, much to my chagrin.
50% of my
Okay.
Java API listing.
Okay, that's a little nerdier. Do you visit that often?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay. So people visit and revisit. So what's interesting is that all three people had been to the page they just recently visited. And in general, I'm not going to show some overall summary metrics, but 60 to 80% of the web pages you visit, you've been to before. And again, that's something that a retrieval engine, if you do any amount of personalization, should be able to leverage. And by analogy to the revisitation curves, to the change curves, we have these revisitation curves, which are just histograms of the revisit interval. So you start with a page here, I revisit it at a short interval. Later, I revisit it at a somewhat longer interval, and then I revisit it at a short interval again. So we can characterize pages by a histogram of the intervisit interval. And in this case, this page is visited most frequently at this sort of intermediate interval, a little bit for, with a greater duration, and then a little bit less with smaller durations. Okay? And what we're going to look at is a relationship between these revisit curves and the change curves I showed you earlier. But before I do that, I want to talk about, so we computed this for millions of pages and came up with 4 general clusters of revisitation patterns. Okay, and I'll just show them to you really briefly. The first is, they show up in these little spark lines. The first is what we cleverly called fast. And what this kind of curve means is that I revisit this page over and over and over again, but at a very short interval, and then never come back to it. Okay, and there are a bunch of pages that look like this. These pages tend to be pages where people are doing hub and spoke navigation. So here's an example, I think, of kitten wallpaper. You go to this page, you go away from the page, come back, go away from the page, come back, go away from the page, and come back. And there are a bunch of pages that people revisit in that way. Okay? There are a class of pages that have this kind of early peak, but also that you come back to later. These tend to be really sort of high-quality shopping sites, things like grocery stores, Land's End, LL Bean kinds of catalogs. These are pages, again, where you do a lot of hub and spoke navigation, but you also revisit them later in time. There are pages, kind of like the Wisdom homepage that I showed you earlier, that people revisit after some interval of time, daily, weekly, maybe like Mark, you spend half your time on so you revisit that probably often and kind of at not such long durations. These tend to be the most popular pages. People tend to go back to them over and over again. A lot of them are portals and various kinds of web applications.
Newspapers as well, right?
Yes, newspapers. I'll show you an example of the New York Times. Newspapers are interesting. People tend to visit them with some daily or weekly periodicity, but often within a day. So people will check stocks or weather or things like that on news pages.
Some have a talk in the newspaper also because they're reading.
Yeah. Right. Right. So you see, actually for news pages, you tend to see an early peak. It looks a little bit more like this, although this peak occurs earlier on, so maybe daily or every other day. And then there are these slow pages that people revisit, but only at extended periods of time. So things like banking pages, any IRS pages look a lot like this. So you care a lot about the IRS, but not all that often, one would hope. So there are these characteristic revisitation patterns. And an interesting question is, before I get to that, I was going to say, an interesting question is the extent to which these patterns are related to changes in content. But before I do that, I want to talk about revisitation and search, because that is an important kind of revisitation. So 33% of the searches that you enter, you've entered before. Okay, 67% of the queries are new queries, but 33% are things you've done before. And for those pages, and when you repeat a query, 29% of the time you click on the same URL, and 4% of the time you click on a different URL. Conversely, you may ask different queries and get to the same URL. So people do try to get back to a page like research.microsoft.com, and they may ask different queries to get there. But a lot of, in the aggregate, 43% of your interactions with a search engine are either repeat queries or repeat visits to pages that you've been to before. And as a search engine provider, that means tremendous opportunity to leverage your previous history of interaction to provide better kinds of retrieval. Yep.
I was wondering, have you noticed, or I don't know if you've seen this number in previous years, but the repeat query number, but have you noticed that as the quality of web search has gone up, that has grown? I mean, it seems like now I'm more likely to rely on them.
For navigation, so you're more likely to rely on navigation. Right. That's been true for, so we collected this probably 3 years ago now. I think it was true that entire time. It certainly changed from the early days when it was a little more variable what you might get. There are other kinds of things like the autocomplete or the drop down in the query box. Some of those kinds of things I think are certainly influencing the number of typos you get, the number of queries that don't lead to much. But there is a lot of refining, even in an application like search, which we think of as an information discovery tool. A lot of people use it for navigation. Okay, so the relationship between change and revisit. Okay, so now we're going to go back again. Sanjeev, why did you revisit the web page that you revisited?
I was looking for a change. Somebody was.
Okay, so you were looking for new information. Brilliant. Mark, new information.
Oh, because I couldn't remember the last time I did it.
Okay. So you were looking for the same information. So Sanjeev was looking for new information. You were looking for the same information. And in general, people have lots of, I think I actually got all of these. People have lots of motivations for revisiting. Sometimes they want to monitor something. That's sort of what you were doing. Sometimes they want to affect change. That's what Mark was doing. And sometimes you want to go back where change is unimportant, right? You just want to refine old stuff. And in these cases, actually, change interferes with refining. It does for web search engines. If results move in position, people are less likely to click on them and click on them more slowly than if they stay in the same position. Lots of summary metrics, so people revisit more. The more often a page changes, the more often people revisit. The shorter the time between page changes, the more people revisit. There are a bunch of summary numbers like this, and the paper reports a bunch of them. But I now want to turn to the relationship between these change and revisitation curves. So there are 3 pages I'm going to show here. The New York Times, Woot.com. Do people know what Woot.com is? Yeah. So it's a page that has daily electronic specials. It changes. What time in the morning does it change? Like 6 a.m. or something? It changes once a day and exactly once a day. And there's a really cool electronic special there. What's that? Midnight? Okay, that would make a very good time. Midnight somewhere it changes. And then Costco is a large retailer. So all of these pages, if you look at them from the perspective of how fast the content changes and what the asymptotic level is, have very, very similar curves that show up very purplish on a blue background there. But believe me, the curves all kind of look alike. Now, what's interesting about these is that the revisitation patterns are actually quite different. So for the New York Times, people actually tend to revisit the New York Times ahead of when the change happens, and then also right when the change happens. So there's a major peak early on, so people are doing this kind of hub and spoke navigation, but there's also a later peak for the New York Times. And I think most of the news sites and forums are like that.
Right, and what this curve here is representing the pattern of a single user.
This is aggregated over all users. Right.
Right, I understand, but you're not saying that there are some people read it at one time of day and some people read it at another time of day.
No, this is for an individual, the aggregate. If I sum up the histogram of intervisit intervals, this is what it looks like. So it could actually be that there are some people who use it hub and spoke and never come back, and then others who only come back periodically. But my guess is that most people do both. Woot.com, people only visit it once a day, and exactly once a day. Costco, people visit way after the change has happened. Okay, so what's happening? We actually thought there might be more relationship between these, and so what we decided in looking in much more detail is that it's important to consider not just revisitation and change in the aggregate, but to look at components within a page. So this is the page for Wisdom, a conference on web search and data mining from a year ago. And what's important is that different elements change at different rates. So the goop on the right is kind of the news site. That changes very fast. The nav stuff at top doesn't change very fast. And the stuff sort of on the left pane changes at kind of an intermediate rate. And so what we believe now is that revisitation patterns, the extent to which revisitation patterns kind of resonate or agree with one of these within-page change frequencies tells you something about why people are revisiting the web page. So people are not revisiting the web page to check out changes in the header. Right? They're not revisiting it to browse the latest updates, even though those are really important for somebody running the conference. What they're visiting it at is to look at stuff that changes maybe at an intermediate period of time. And so this can serve as a kind of way to understand what the important words on a page are from a user's perspective. Yeah.
You're trying to distinguish the revisitation and the changes independently. Don't you need to actually do something like rotation?
Yeah, what we should do, so again, these are in the aggregate. What we should probably do it is at the individual level. So there may be people who come back to pay attention to one portion of the page and not the other.
Yeah. That's the question.
Okay.
This is also what confused me on the previous slide. You said people are coming back way after the change happens.
Right.
But that graph didn't show us when the change happened.
It shows you when the change is asymptoted.
No, I think what the graph showed is that the time between
So the graph showed that. Whoa! Did the colors change? Yeah. So the graph showed that there's a bunch of change in these intervals, right?
But that interval is just, it's measured, if it changes at midnight every day, for one user that interval is at 9 in the morning, for another user that interval is at noon, it's that interval.
No, but these are for the page. We crawl the page independent of any user visits. So we crawl the page at every hour over a 24-hour period of time. And if these are hours, then this, we see a lot of change even after the first hour. We see the change kind of asymptoting after 10 or 12 hours. So the content changes are independent of any user revisitation patterns. Let me go on. Let me just go on through this because I actually want to get to stuff we've done to support this. So one of the interesting things is you can take any page and kind of superimpose a revisitation filter on it. A filter that tells you, if you believe this resonance idea, what it is that people are interested in on the page. And so for the New York Times, these are the things that change at the same rate as which people revisit. On the Woot.com page, that's all that matters, right? It's what the the sale for the day is. And then on the Costco page, what's really interesting is you're sure these ads are changing constantly, but people visit that very infrequently. What they want to do when you go to Costco is look up a price, search, and things like that. So I think it's still a little speculative, but we believe that this can provide a nice lens onto words that are interesting given people's interactions with the pages. And I'm not sure I understood the question, and we'll follow up offline. Yeah.
So let me maybe characterize what I thought I
Yeah.
understood in your examples. That with a page like Costco, I'm relating to my own experience.
Yeah.
Indeed, when I go to their web page, they have so many ads on the front page, and that's typically not what I'm interested in.
Right, and so that's exactly what that.
Search for a product.
That's right.
And so what I'm looking for is right on the top.
Right.
And
Yep.
in fact, this might be one case where I'm interested in the non-changing portion of the page, almost.
Yes, for most pages that people visit at very long intervals, well after the content has asymptoted to a steady state, that they typically want to deal with the static content. Yep. Which is really interesting. And those pages tend to be found by search engines, by search more than other means. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. That was a high-level overview of dynamics in terms of content and people's interactions with it. I want to talk in the next 20 minutes or so, maybe 10 minutes on each, about things that we've done to help people, to support people in understanding change. So the first is a tool that is a browser plugin that shows people what's changed on a page since they last visited. And the second is a new class of retrieval models that leverage temporal dynamics, both in terms of setting non-uniform priors on objects and in terms of differential term weights. Okay, we do these things. Okay, so diff.ie is, and it's not diffy, it's differences in IE, is a browser plugin that highlights what has changed on a page since I last visited. Okay. Yeah, it totally, I heard cool it's totally cool, and it will be available at a website near you in December. There's several interesting features, I think. One is that it's always on. So you don't have to, like an RSS feed, subscribe to a page that you think is going to change. You visit a page, whether it's to consume static information or changing information, and you see whether or not something's changed. It's in situ. You don't have to switch to a new viewing mode that shows you the dynamics. It's there. It's pretty non-intrusive. It's configurable what color you want to make this and at what intensity, and you can turn it off for individual pages. But by and large, just seeing a little bit of the page highlighted is, I find, and most of our participants find, not at all intrusive. And what's really cool is it's new to you. So news sites and stock report sites, they often show you, like, stock is rising or there's a new breaking story. Well, that's new from an editor's perspective. It's not new from my perspective. If I was just there 30 seconds ago, it's not new. If I haven't been there for a week, maybe the whole page is new. And so I think it's actually very interesting that it highlights what's different given your previous interactions. And so I'm just going to do a bunch of screenshots characterizing the kinds of things that the kinds of things that get highlighted. So here's a case where this is the New York Times homepage from last night. There are a bunch of things that got highlighted. Some are not all that interesting, so the time changed. 35 minutes ago changed. But one of the lead stories changed. Another lead story changed. Some of the items, new items, were featured in politics. If you go further down, the most blogged and the most forwarded pages often change in their order. And so this is a case where I went to consume change, but it also made it very easy for me to focus in on regions that I hadn't seen before. It's used for monitoring, so this is my Twitter feed. You can see that people who've posted since I was last there. Here's a case where there was unexpected but interesting content. So I spoke in Glasgow a couple weeks ago at a conference called the European Conference on Digital Libraries. And so at the beginning of the page, you see that, like, the welcome reception is there. The conference had just started, so they say, welcome to ECDL. But what was really kind of fun on this is I saw that there was a tour to the distillery. And they had just put in the announcement about where to meet the buses to go on the distillery tour. And so I didn't go there to consume this, but it was actually very useful to know. You could also meet all of the student volunteers. So student volunteers and distillery tour, this was an unexpectedly delightful sort of information to hear about. There are also serendipitous encounters. So I came to your homepage. And I can see here that there are changes, this was last week, of what kinds of seminars are happening. There are a couple of new features here that I had not encountered before. Okay. So it's interesting, it's not the reason I visited. I went to find out somebody's email address or phone number, but it was sort of interesting that that had changed. There's also another really kind of fascinating thing that you see with this plugin, and that is it helps you understand page dynamics. So these are search results. You think search results are pretty stable. This isn't a very trendy topic. It's Jamie Tevan, who's a collaborator of mine. But so ads change a lot. The number of results change. Here's some fun things that change. This is DBLP. It lists her new paper. Here it lists how many connections she has in LinkedIn. She won a TR35 award, which I might not have noticed had she not worked closely with me. So even for search results, there are cases where the result doesn't change, but the content of it does, and you see it in the snippet. There are cases when the results actually change. So if you typed in Jamie Tevan before she won the award, TR35 did not appear. And then there are some sort of noise things around the edge. So this gives you a really different perspective on how a page is changing. It really lets you see how quickly results are changing. My favorite example is if you look at news aggregator sites, they change, like every time you hit carriage returns, something's changing on those pages. They feel like they're the same, the clusters are more or less the same, but they're always putting in new stories and new features, and it's a much, much more dynamic world than I realized without this plugin. And so, again, to summarize, there are a bunch of cases where you go to a page expecting to consume change, and this helps you, I think, focus in on what actually has changed. And what I think is really more fun and what people get excited about is the fact that there's all this revisitation that puts sort of a new lens on how you're viewing the world. It really allows you to see something about the dynamics of the content that you're interacting with. Some of it is not relevant to your task. Others of it are really relevant. So when you went to the page for Fred's memorial today, if you had had this, it would have highlighted immediately whether something had changed. Editors use this a lot to see whether their edits have propagated. They go back and refresh a page until something appears here. And so it actually has really put, again, a new lens on how I view pages. I think we did a bunch of studies with this. We have some buttons on the toolbar that allow you to click a smiley face or a frowny face if you think it's annoying and in your face, or if you think it's delightful. We did surveys both before and after people had used it for a while. We logged the URLs visited and the amount of change. For both of these, we logged only the hash of the URL and the amount of change. So we have no idea what pages people are visiting. All we know is how often they revisit and by how much. And then we did some interviews. I think I'm actually going to skip most of these results. Once people start using this, they actually visit pages. They revisit pages more often than before. And they visit pages that change more than they did before. It's almost as if this is providing a way to help people understand dynamic content so they're willing to go back to it more often. And again, this will be available publicly in as soon as our developer comes back from his vacation. I don't dare release something publicly until he comes back. So I think December 8th is when we're going to launch it.
Can I ask you a quick question about what you mean by change? Because I was just thinking of the replying to that.
Yeah.
Often articles move from being right under the picture
Yeah.
to this little bulleted list. Is that considered a change?
Yeah, it's not. We made some decisions. The earliest prototypes, and you can still check it in advanced things, would color moves in a different color than additions, and deletions would have some sort of transparency in places they had been. That was just like a visual nightmare. So now all we do is look at additions. If something moves, it looks like a deletion from one point and an addition somewhere else. And we're doing it at the level of DOM elements. So if if the DOM structure of your page reflects something about the kinds of changes, then it makes a lot more sense than if it doesn't.
No, I was inclined to say that's not a change in my opinion. It's just
A move? It is interesting to know that it moves, but right now that's not. Is that reflected? It depends on the DOM structure. So yeah, it's hard to look at flips at leaf levels in the DOM, but other kinds of change. If it moves up or down a level, we'll call that a change. So I talked about diff.ie, which is one example. There are a couple of other kinds of things that people have built for understanding change. So Eitan Adair and his colleagues built a system called Zoetrope that allows you to select a region of a web page. You can select it either spatially, so you might want to look at the picture on the New York Times. You can select it by content. You can select it by some DOM representation. And then that proactively goes out and fetches that content, and then you can go backward and forward in time. Diffamation is actually a fun system by some folks from INRIA, where they look at web pages and show you the dynamics of, they show you the smooth transitions between successive versions of a web page. It's very, very hard to do this in an understandable way for text. If you're seeing individual words move around, it's not clear what's changing. And so we've tended to focus at a somewhat different level of abstraction, but it's, that's good for some purposes and not others. And then people do a variety of kinds of temporal summaries and snippets. People also have looked at various kinds of changes in people's interaction with web content. This is an old system called Editware and Readware, where people in the, Will Hill and Jim Holland and others, in the scroll bar reflected where people were interacting with the document. This was actually very, very useful for code, so you could tell where somebody had mucked around with the code recently, and that's likely where the bugs were. But it's a very passive reflection of interaction history. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about in the next 5 minutes is how we can leverage these dynamics for improving retrieval. As I've said all along, current retrieval algorithms look at a single time slice of the information. It's sort of either, if you're working with a test collection, it's whatever you're given. If you're working with a crawler, it's whatever was crawled, whatever's on the page at the time that was crawled. But web pages are changing a lot, and so there are at least two ways in which we can leverage this information. One is to set different priors on objects, perhaps depending on how frequently they change. Another is to look at these term longevity plots and maybe treat words that are there all the time very differently than you treat words that are there only transiently. And so we're going to use a very simple language modeling approach as it's used in information retrieval, not necessarily in speech, where we have both a change prior and kind of term longevity information is going to feed into the second component of that. So page change is indeed related to the quality of pages. For this, Microsoft has a large effort in judging the relevance of pages to queries. Judgments are made typically on a 5-point scale. So given a query, is a page absolutely critical to have? Is it a very good page? Is it okay? Is it fair? Or is it not relevant? Okay, and one of the things we found empirically is that perfect pages, so the best rated pages, change much more often, twice as often as the very bad pages. Empirical observation. Not so unexpected, because a lot of the absolutely, so if I type in, JHU computer science, I darn well better find your homepage and not some, random trip report about a high school class that came to visit. That would be one of these absolutely must-have pages. Those tend to change more often. They tend to be curated, they're updated, and so we do find a relationship between change and quality. And so we're going to use that as a document prior in addition to all the other kinds of document priors that people have. Okay, so that's going to go there. Term patterns vary over time. What we did here is very, very simple. We split the words on a page into sort of 3 bins: words that are always there, words that are sometimes there, and words that are only transiently there. And we're just going to combine them with a simple mixture, okay, linear mixture. We did it over the entire history. Well, for this experiment, I think it was, what does it say here? 10 weeks. So it's a 2.5-month period. It's actually very interesting to think about changes that are more recent and differentially weight those than changes that happened in the long-term past. That's especially true. I don't know how true it is for words. It's especially true, I think you want to do that for interaction history. So web search engines use a lot of interaction history to improve their ranking. If I present a result at position 3 and everybody's clicking on it, well, I'll move it up to position 1, or I'm really stupid. If people have anchor text, that anchor text comes in over time. What's interesting is all those forms of interaction history, whether it's anchor text or click data or revisitation data, tend to favor old pages over new pages. So if you have a breaking event, you're not going to have good information about interaction history for that, where you have it for much older pages. And so I think that's a case where you very much want to differentially weight the sources of evidence. We didn't do it here. So what we worked on here is we focused on 2,000 navigational queries. So these are queries like Johns Hopkins Computer Science Department, where somebody says, yes, there's an absolutely canonical page that I think must be returned, or New York Times, or Microsoft Research. So those are cases where somebody is actually using the query to navigate to a page, because search engines are often very good at that. The reason we use these, and I'll get back to this at the very end, is we believe that for navigational queries, relevance judgments were consistent over time. So in Johns Hopkins Computer Science, I'm always going to want to go to the CS page. It's not going to change very much. Whereas Hurricane Earl or Lady Gaga, or there are lots of very spiky queries. The relevance of pages to those might change over time. So we focused on this for pragmatic reasons, and we learned a model that had a change prior and the parameter weights for the different terms with different longevity. And what we found was, here's the baseline language model. If we include the dynamic model, the one that splits words into three classes with different longevity, you see about a 5% gain in NDCG for different cutoffs. So this is basically precision at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something sort of like that, weighted by how relevant the document is and what its position is. If you incorporate the change prior, we actually improve a lot, but tend to overfit at the very top position. If you combine both the change prior and the dynamic model, you do a good deal better at every position for this task. Okay. So the ongoing work in this area, again, I said we focused on these navigational queries because we thought the relevance judgments were static over time. We're now actually biting the bullet and trying to collect relevance judgments that vary in time. So we have a series of hundreds of queries that we're collecting explicit relevance judgments on every week, and in conjunction with that, looking at query frequency over time, page content over time, and interaction data over time. And let me just show you an example of some of the kinds of things we've found here. We're not as far along in this. So this is a query called March Madness. Do folks know what March Madness is? College basketball, that's very good. That's not enough you're not going to be a relevance assessor for us in this query. So March Madness is what's typically used to refer to the NCAA basketball tournament, which starts in early March and ends in early April. Actually, last year it ran from March 15th to April 4th. Okay, and we had a bunch of pages. So now in March 25th, the pages that were most relevant to that are two very high quality pages that featured dynamic content about March Madness. So one is ncaa.com, the other is cbssports.com. Now those pages are really good, high quality pages. They don't always talk about March Madness, but in the middle of March Madness, they do talk about it. So these were rated the most highly relevant. There are a bunch of general resources about March Madness, sort of a Mahala Wikipedia-like page. These were rated very good in the middle of March Madness, partly because although they're good historically, they provide a lot of background, they don't have up-to-date scores. And then this is the sort of thing that we often return in search engines. This was NCAA March Madness from 2008, and nobody really liked that in 2010. Okay? So that's what it was during March Madness. If you go out 2 months, 3 months to May, these have flipped around, and the general resource pages are now rated most highly. CBS Sports and NCAA.com are just as irrelevant as a 2008 page, because now those pages are featuring whatever happens in May, so it's baseball or something else. So this is actually very interesting data. I think it's hard to model. We're hoping that there are some classes of pages like this that we can come up with a richer representation of. But this happens all the time. It's not just for pages like hurricanes or sports scores. Lots of pages have the most relevant content different at different points in time. And there is a lot of work on, not a lot, there's some work on temporal dynamics. Just over the last couple of years, there are 2 other groups that are starting to look at this. This group actually did a fun thing. They're a group from Emory University. They looked at Wikipedia pages. So Wikipedia is a fun collection because we have the edit history. They looked at Wikipedia pages and tried to differentially weight terms by how often they had been on the page and how often they appear in various kinds of revisions. Okay, so that's a really interesting notion of term importance that goes above and beyond the sort of standard TF-IDF. Document dynamics have long been used for crawling web pages. So pages that change more often, you're going to crawl more often. Query dynamics, as I said before, are used to understand which queries are spiking. Again, if we see spiking queries, we may want to focus on dynamic content. But in general, it tells, if you're a search engine and you see a spike in a query, you darn well better get your act together and start crawling pages that you think might be relevant to that. You may want to interject news. So all the web search engines, Fernando Diaz reported on some work at Yahoo, where they do spike detection and then integrate news stories if it's relevant with regular search results. So there is some work in query dynamics. And again, query dynamics can be used for all sorts of other things. People have used them to measure similarity between queries. Queries that have similar temporal profiles are likely to be very related. Steve Chen did some work in that, and Alex was telling me today some work that he's done trying to look at monolingual resources to try to understand what words might, cross-lingual resources, to understand what words might be the same over time by looking at their co-occurrence. And then I think this is actually a fascinating one, thinking about extraction of entities from within documents. People are looking at temporal expressions within documents. And this is a fun effort by some folks at Los Alamos, where they're actually developing protocols for retrieving versions of a web page. So instead of saying, just show me the current version, you might be able to say, show me older versions of this web page. They're not worried about where it's stored, but at least if this effort takes off, there will be a protocol level way of asking for older information. So just to summarize, what I've talked about today is very broadly how content changes over on the web, both within a page and at the term level. I've talked about how people revisit and refine information. And in both of these cases, it's very clear that the world does not satisfy many of our modeling assumptions about queries being equally likely, pages being equally interesting. We've talked some about how we can use the relationship between revisitation and change to help us identify maybe why people are revisiting, what words on a page are important. And then we've developed 2 different systems. Diff-IE is one, and the temporal IR models are another, that try to leverage change in order to improve retrieval. Tons of opportunities and challenges here. The temporal dynamics are really pervasive. They influence absolutely every aspect of a retrieval system, from protocol level to how do you index version collections efficiently, how do you use that to inform crawling, document representations. What we did in our experiments was we kept K different static snapshots, but that's not a very interesting thing. What you want to do is figure out what sufficient statistics are that you need to keep to do this kind of weighting efficiently. Huge issues in the right retrieval models, evaluation, prediction, and analysis. So a ton of really interesting challenges and opportunities. And for me, this is one example. It's only one of about a half dozen things that I work on. But to me, it's an interesting example of a very important kind of context that we need to take into account in retrieval. And let me just end with this slide, which talks about, in my mind, just the 3 main sources of contextual information that one needs to leverage to have excellent kinds of information management systems. One is sort of where the queries are coming from. So I've called it here user context, but it could be device, it could be geolocation. Queries don't fall from the sky. There are real live human beings at the other end of them, and they have very different needs, one from the other. Their needs are evolving within a session. They may be very focused within a session, and there are a lot of regularity there, and we need to understand where the queries are coming from. Documents are very, very richly interrelated. All you see on most standard web pages is a big ranked list. But there are lots of relationships among documents. So temporal evolution is one, but there are lots of others. And I think the more that we can represent documents by rich and faceted metadata, the more we can understand and improve them. And then lastly, people search because they're trying to do something. Much as I love search and I've devoted 30 years of my life to studying it, people you don't get up in the morning and say, hey, I think I've got 10 minutes till kill, let me search. You search because you're trying to do something. And the more we can understand about that, whether it's the specific task, the nature of the task, is it something you're going to return to, the more I think we can support that. So thank you for your attention. DIFIE is coming soon, and lots of information about individual things on my webpage. Thanks. James.
Some of the changes
References.
on the webpage reflect changes in the world,
Yes.
and some of them are just changes in presentation. From, say, an information extraction viewpoint, that's
Yep.
very important. Can
Yep.
you look at that at all, or ways to know which kind of change you're looking at?
Yeah, we were just talking about that in Wikipedia, right? So if something happens in the world, there'll be a bunch of edits, but also somebody might just go through and can change all the British spelling to English spelling or vice versa. One thing I think you can do is look at change in different streams of information. So you can look at it on web pages and query logs. Query logs are not likely to spike if somebody just goes through and decides to do stylistic edits. You can look at it in different media. So the blogosphere tends to lead the news media in some things and lag it in others. That's one way that I might approach it, but we haven't really looked at that very systematically. Do you have ideas?
No, I don't.
Okay. Yeah, David. Oops. Yeah. So one idea when we did the revisitation curves is if we could predict when we're going to revisit a page, we could actually alert you if the page had changed, even though you hadn't yet revisited it. So there was some notion like that. We've also built several proactive retrieval systems that go out and find stuff that's related to what you're doing. I think maybe the most interesting thing relative to that is we're now trying to model when somebody is engaged in a search task, whether they're done when they leave or whether they're likely to come back to it. If they're likely to come back to it, what you could do is retrieve information that other people who've seen these pages have seen, and so to make it a much more useful situation when you come back. So it's certainly something that we're thinking about but haven't done certainly as much as we have on this. Yeah. Yep.
It occurs to me that you might want to combine DIFIE with the frequency assessment so that you would only highlight those changes that were in the frequency band.
Oh, I see.
Person was
Mm-hmm.
now you said discovery was an important piece of this, and I'm sure people like this. They might not have looked at the other frequency bands, but maybe there's a change and would want to look at it.
Yeah, so to me that the resonance tells you something about the user's information need. And there are times when we're going to highlight whatever changed, not just stuff that we think is interesting to you. I think we could filter out a lot of the noisy changes like the time and the number of people who visited the page changing that are very unlikely to anything you're interested in. But we'd also miss a lot of others. So these serendipitous cases where, I didn't come to the the ECDL page to find out who the student volunteers were. So I think you would lose some of that. My inclination is just to continue to highlight it independent of your revisitation rate, but it's certainly something we could line up better. We have done, for individual web pages, developed representations that highlight how often different DOM elements change, independent of your revisitation. So that's taking the page, so to summarize page change in different, when you can see very clearly that some regions are constantly changing and others change less often. So we've done a little bit of it from the perspective of the page, but not from the perspective of the user. Yep.
So have you considered that sometimes something might not have changed since the last time you viewed the page, but since the last time you paid attention?
Yeah. That's a hard one.
And I was thinking about they were talking about with code, they show how long
Yeah.
it's looked at a particular piece.
It's hard to know. If you had gaze tracking, it would be easy. You might be able to get some of that even with scroll patterns. But how much you see on a page depends on your screen resolution. It depends on the font size. It depends on, whether you have any magnification and so on. We could probably do a better job than we have about highlighting things that are way off the bottom of a page that you never scroll to, but we haven't done that.
At the very least, if you have a spoken hub type thing, I assume if you hit back, it won't sort of reset.
Oh, it does. It resets.
It does reset. So if I go to a page, click on one, click back, then nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed, yeah. Unless something has changed, but nothing.
It seems like you want it to, well, I don't know what you want.
It's conceivable that for revisits within a very short period of time, you want to leave it to what there was before. Yep. But one of my favorite demos is you go to news sites and you hit refresh every 15 seconds and stuff's changing. It constantly, and it's not just the time. There's like real substantive stuff that you just never knew about.
Maybe hitting refresh is different from hitting back as far as user.
Sure. Yeah, it's easy enough to distinguish those, yes.
So you have a binary notion of change in FIE. Have you looked at gradations of change? Different kinds of highlighting, depending on.
Yeah, we actually did, we played with something where we show in different intensities how long ago it was that something changed, not by different amounts, but by time. It's really hard visually to distinguish more than 2 or 3 levels of intensity like that. So every time we tried to make it more complex, we could come up with a few scenarios that it was killer for, and it just ruined a lot of other things. So, but it would be important to understand, I think, semantic differences in ways that we're not doing a very good job of now. We make no pretense of trying to do that. Yeah. Oh, actually, the other reason why we can't highlight the amount of change is the way we encode changes for each element of a DOM tree, including all of its parents. We take a hash of that element and store the hash. And so all we know is if that element changed. And so if your page is constructed so that everything is one big DOM element, then we're just going to highlight it all. And we did that partly for efficiency reasons, partly for privacy preserving reasons. It's all stored on the client, but if we store hashes, it's even less of a concern than if we store text. So we can't tell you very much, but we can tell you when it changed. Yep.
So the question, this has to do with the temporal IR.
Yeah.
So you have this P of Q given D, and the point was that the document D keeps changing in time. So you can't have a static model of P of Q given D, and
Right.
try to do things with which terms in the document are stable over
Right,
time.
right.
But that makes me think that maybe there is something flawed even in that basic model altogether.
Yeah.
Maybe then this is motivated by thinking about the NCAA main page. Right?
Yeah.
So the NCAA main page is the authority page for a number of different queries at different points in time.
Right, and so the idea is that, so two answers to, yeah. I want to answer some other question.
Given D that says that this document tends to be a very good document for this query, but it also was a very good document for some other query at the same time.
Right.
And in other words, now I want to know not just this one query, but what P of Q given D is for a host of Qs.
Right.
I want a distribution on Q.
Yep.
And then I want to take the position that documents which are extremely relevant to different queries at different times, those documents have this problem where temporal modeling is very important for them.
I see.
Other documents, which are
Yeah.
always relevant to the same query and irrelevant to others at
Right.
different times,
Right.
for them I don't need temporal
Right.
modeling.
So one thing I should have made really clear in that, and I didn't because I was rushing over stuff, is that when we looked at the combination weights, for these navigational queries, what we learned was that the static component matters a lot more than the dynamic components. And the intuition is that for queries that are spiking, the dynamic component will matter much more than it will for queries that are static. And so that's sort of like what you're saying, but you're asking something a little different, which is if a page is very dynamic and it's relevant to different queries at different points in time, that tells me something that's kind of a combination of how relevant it is to this query at this point in time, as well as maybe something about the priors on that document.
It's almost
Yeah.
like this is an authority page for multiple subjects, but it can't put on multiple hats at the same time.
At the same time, yep. And so we're counting on the query bursts in query frequencies to tell us about what words are important right now.
Because what I think is missing in the
Yep.
basic IR model is there is no notion of looking at, for each query you look at all documents. But for each document, you don't look at all
Right.
queries to see
That's right. That's right.
how it relates to different, it can't possibly.
But we certainly are knowing for every document the overall popularity of that query now. So if the query is uniformly popular over time,
Right.
then it's not likely to want the dynamic content on the page, is the hypothesis. And we'll see once we've collected this data set the extent to which that holds. But it is interesting to integrate sort of the document as a reflection of multiple queries. Perspective, yep.
So would it make sense to, in a slow motion of residence, to do it at the individual term level in that kind? So if you had term frequency as a function in time, you do almost a Fourier decomposition of that time series,
Yeah.
and then figure out which terms seem to correlate with a person's visitation frequency, and then somehow those would be somehow factored into relevance.
Right, we were doing it at the DOM element level. Why didn't we do it at the term level? I don't remember why we didn't do it at the individual term level. You're absolutely right. Given everything else we looked at the level of individual terms, it would make sense to consider doing that. Although terms that appear in different regions, so you can have the same term appearing in different regions, but we didn't do it. Other questions? Okay, thanks.